All right. Hey, how are you? I wanted to make a video that was a little bit different than stuff I've made in the past, and this is going to be a book summary and sort of a book review. And the book that I'm going to be talking about today is called The Subprime Attention Crisis. If you're anywhere on the internet as you are right now, you're getting served advertisements. The book discusses this online advertising market and actually compares that market to the 2008 mortgage crisis and argues that there will eventually be a collapse of some sort, like a bursting of the market bubble that could have a lot of consequences. And in general, I just find this subject fascinating because I've been looking for some good information on the advertising market and social media ads and just how it all works and like the data behind it. And this book really puts together a lot of great information by somebody who seems to know very well what they're talking about. That guy is Tim Hwang, and so I did a little bit of research into him, and he's worked at Google for 2 years. He's worked at Harvard, led a tech initiative at Harvard. He's published tons of articles on like the Washington Post, Foreign Policy, The Atlantic. This guy just seems incredibly prolific and intelligent, and is just specialized in the tech space, and particularly seems to know a lot about AI as well. If you're interested in online advertising and how these ads get to you, and also just the general market and economic impacts, this is an incredible read. This book came out this year, so this is a new kind of video I'm making. I haven't done this before, but I thought it'd be a great idea to kind of share some of the fascinating things that I've learned, as well as, just basically solidify some of this information in my head by telling you guys. And so I hope it's valuable to you in some way and you take something out of it. If it is, drop a like or comment and tell me what you're thinking, whether you think certain things the author or I'm talking about are right or wrong. What's your perspective? So all right, let me stop talking about it and I'll get started. So he starts off the book by just laying out some of the numbers about the industry in general, the online advertising industry. So in 2018, he says it's about $273 billion in revenue generated worldwide in online advertising, which is a pretty big number. However, by 2022, this number is expected to be about $427 billion, which shows you how fast this industry is increasing and how much money advertisers and publishers are putting into this system. And the main players in this online advertising ecosystem would be Google and Facebook. And it's incredible because this number blew me away. 87% of Google's total revenue comes from online advertising. And I think Facebook was actually way more. Of Facebook's revenue, it was 98% of their revenue comes from advertising. So advertising is like why these media companies exist the way they are. At some point in the book, Tim talks about the initial start of Google. The company wasn't even that big until they invented AdWords and AdSense, which is Google's ad platform, which we'll get into a little bit later. But these created AdSense and AdWords were what turned Google from just a small tech company or relatively normal sized tech company into the behemoth that it is today. And the same thing goes with Facebook. That's why it has so much money, is 98% of its revenue. That's just insane. As far as the different types of online advertising we have, about 46% of it online is search advertising. So as you could guess, a lot of that is largely dominated by Google. And then there's the other type of online advertising, which is like display ads. So you could say like banner ads, images, text on websites. And so that's a huge part of online ads in general. That accounts for about 32%. So in the past, how advertising would work is you'd have a person involved who would negotiate with the buyer and the ad inventory and like sell the ad inventory to the buyer. You'd have somebody there to negotiate the price and figure out how it's going to be displayed and all this kind of stuff. But the world we live in today, a lot of the ad market is dominated by what they call programmatic advertising, which means there's no human involved. So there's a machine that basically decides, where your ad is going to be placed, who it's going to be shown to, when, all of these things, like at the speed of light. It actually isn't even necessarily, if you're talking about Google, it's not even calculated until you've actually searched for something, and then it calculates what ad to show for you in like an instant. So it's actually incredible, and that's one of the biggest reasons that it's become so big of an ecosystem, a part of our economy, that kind of thing. So this whole advertising ecosystem is why we have these amazing products on the internet and why they're free. You know, that's why we can have Google search. That's why we can have a lot of these social media platforms. That's why we can have even, you know, publications online, your favorite news sites. Like, that's all, a lot of their revenue is just a lot of generated by online advertising. And it's why we're not, you know, subscribing to different platforms, each one that we use. And one thing that Tim talks about, and I've heard before from other people, is that we take for granted the fact that the internet is free, but it didn't have to be this way. There's no reason that it would need to develop this way. There's other ways this could have gone, and a lot of it has to do with developments by Google in like the late 1990s. This is a very complicated subject that I don't know as much as I'd like to about, but it's interesting to consider the other types of social media that could exist, or the other forms of internet that could exist if it wasn't based on online advertising as much. For example, one of the cool things that Tim brings up at some point in the book is an alternate type of social media. He called it Super Social Media 3000, and it's basically, imagine you know, you go on to that website and it's just basically the same page. Everyone sees the same page and interacts with the same page, and you don't need to log in, you don't have a profile, everything is just done on that page. Now, I mean, if we try to do that today, obviously it would turn into craziness and people would just deface the page and everything like that. And but there are other potential ways that this could go, and like we could learn to interact online as opposed to the way it is now, where a lot of it is kind of powered by advertising and how to collect our data so that it can be given to advertisers and they can have confidence in advertising on that platform. And that's why a lot of this technological innovation is continuing to be developed. Anyways, that was a little off topic. Honestly, this is kind of a short book, but there's so much good information packed into it. I'm not sure if I'm even doing it justice, but I hope that you're following along and that I'm actually being coherent in the way I'm talking about it, and it's helpful. So I'm gonna take it back a little bit to about the structure of how this ecosystem works. And Tim starts this off by talking about the idea of commoditization. And that's the idea where you take a product and it is given like a constant and dependable value, like generally agreed upon by, you know, society and the economy, and then that allows the market to become so big. This is an interesting concept to think about. I mean, it's basic, but I feel like it's really important. Basically, imagine that you're a grocery store and you are selling, you know, bananas, and you know, in the past, like 100 years ago, let's say, before, like, you might have had you know, you get the bananas delivered to the market, and you know, all the bananas are different sizes, they're different shapes, they're different colors, and you know, the buyer goes into the store and is like, oh, I'm gonna look at this banana, you know, how much is this worth to me? The seller's like, how much? You got to negotiate a price for that banana. Buyer buys it, and then they move on. But let's say the bananas all started to look the same. The bananas are mass produced, they're all about the same size, they're all about the same quality, and that way they can have a constant value. So this allows for people to buy and sell in large quantities. And it also allows the buyer and the seller not to have to interact because trust isn't as needed. So there could be separation there because they both know, oh, this is the item, this is the value, you know, it's already figured out, boom. So this is how commoditization allows the market for a product to expand and become huge. And it's something we do all across all industries, but like, with online advertising, if you think about it, it's a little tricky because as a buyer, if you're going to buy advertising space, let's say you're buying on Facebook, it's difficult to know what exactly you're getting. So the way that we've commoditized it, and that these large companies and the whole market has decided to commoditize it, is using metrics and data that tell you what your ads are doing. So if you've ever heard things like impressions, which is the amount of times that your ad is kind of put in front of somebody, like put on their screen, or like clicks, or click-through rate, like how often when an ad is shown to somebody do they click it, what's the percentage there. There's all these different metrics that people will use to know what effect their advertising has, and if it's worth the money that they're putting into it. So I actually just recently ran my own LinkedIn ad just because I was curious about this, how this worked, and wanted to see how effective it would be. Like, here's, for example, all the data that they gave me from running the ad. They'll give you all this impressions, click-through rate, all this kind of stuff. So now that we've talked about commoditization as it relates to different products, what is the product in online advertising? Well, the product in online advertising is your attention. And so that's what's being commoditized. All of these metrics are trying to measure your attention, and even the quality of your attention, all that kind of stuff. So this is how the sellers and the buyers will decide what's worth it and what's not. So we go back to the argument of this book. It's called Subprime Attention Crisis. So this whole market based around commoditizing our attention, the author, Tim Huang, argues that it could eventually crash, and he thinks it will eventually crash, just like what happened with mortgages in the 2008 financial crisis. So Tim explains that the reason a market would crash is because the perceived value of a commodity is way off from the actual value of the commodity. So what happened, for example, in 2008, and I don't know very much about this or economics, so I'm just going to do my best to explain what I learned from the book, is that what happened was there was these mortgages that were being sold, and a lot of people even outside the US would be buying these mortgages, and basically the banks were incentivized to continue selling these mortgages even if they were bad mortgages and more and more unlikely to be paid off. But they were incentivized to keep selling these mortgages. There was lack of regulation, so different agencies, companies would give out AAA ratings to these mortgages, even if they were terrible mortgages, which increased the confidence in the mortgage market, the false confidence in the market. And eventually, there was, it came to a head. There was elements that basically demonstrated to everybody that it wasn't as valuable as they thought it was, these mortgages, and the whole market was kind of built on somewhat of a lie. And so that is what Tim talks about and relates to the online advertising market. Basically, one of the reasons that this happens is because there's not accurate data, and that's really important to making sure that the value of the commodity matches the perceived value of the commodity. So Tim has a bunch of good arguments for what contributes to this. One of them being that it's very easy to get accurate data on your own advertising, like on my ads on LinkedIn, I got the impressions, I knew how many people clicked on my website, things like that. But it's more difficult to get accurate information on market-wide data, which is also important to understanding this. So you need market-wide data. And who has the market-wide data? Well, Google, Facebook, these big digital advertising sellers and publishers have this data, and their incentive isn't to give us accurate data. Their incentive is to increase the confidence in this market so that more and more people will spend money on online advertising. So they're not sharing a lot of that data that they have, and there's been different instances where it's the data that they've released, for example, from Facebook, has been misrepresented by them, and so misinterpreted by people, or just that the data is just not being shared at all, or we don't know how accurate it is, or we don't know what data is missing, all that kind of stuff. And so this could be a problem because there's also no regulation on this at this point, or there's hardly any regulation. Another point that Tim brings up is the role of marketing agencies in this whole thing, because traditionally a lot of marketing agencies and these middleman people would, you have a person who has ad inventory on their website, and then you have the buyer, and then the marketing agency would kind of be the middleman to, find the ad space and then sell it to the buyer. And then, that's how they would make a lot of their money in online marketing. So the thing is, programmatic marketing, the machines that are basically automating the sale of ad inventory, are taking the place of these marketing agencies, and they're connecting the buyer and the ad inventory seller directly. You don't need this third party anymore. There's other reasons that marketing agencies are also becoming less relevant and losing profit margins, because of the fact that a lot of companies are starting to make their internal agencies. They're making content creation internally as well instead of outsourcing it. So these marketing agencies and the way they've done things in the past is changing, and their decreasing profit margins means they need to make money somehow. So they're doing something called arbitrage. Arbitrage is where a marketing agency would basically buy ad inventory from a seller and then sell it to somebody else with a higher price. So what this does, it's again contributing to the increase of perceived market value as compared to the actual market value of online advertising commodities. So there's a bunch of other factors that are contributing to this dynamic as well. One of them being ad blocking and ad fraud. So ad fraud is basically, what you would guess. It's basically people selling ad inventory that is not real. And there's billions of dollars that are a part of this ad fraud worldwide, and it's quite significant, and a lot of people are spending their money there, and that actually is meaning that they're not selling something real, and again increasing the perceived value of the market as opposed to the actual value of the market. The other thing is ad blocking, which is becoming increasingly popular, especially among younger people. And I use it myself. I don't know the last time I've seen a YouTube ad because I have ad blocking on. And people are starting to implement it a lot more in mobile devices. I think it was over 50% of people in India use ad blocking on their phone, which is a crazy number. So these ad companies that are reporting the amount of ads shown isn't always accurate because of a lot of this ad blocking, where people aren't even seeing the ads, but it might show up as a number to the seller. You got this amount of impressions, but nobody ever saw it. Another important factor here is that young people are paying less and less attention to online advertising. And I can just, anecdotally, I've actually seen this. It's just a lot of young people are just ignoring a lot of this online advertising or finding ways around it, such as this ad blocker. And not only that, they're more aware when they're being targeted by online advertising. And that trend seems to be increasing, the more prevalent it is. So what happens if there is a big market crash like this? Why should we even care? So you have these big tech conglomerates like Google and Facebook, whose the majority of their revenue is based off of this online advertising. And so they have a ton of products that are funded through this online advertising. And they also have other things that they're doing, such as nonprofit or charitable things, or just corporate responsibility programs. And these are huge because these are huge companies all around the world, and these won't have funding. The technology leaps that we've been making aren't necessarily going to have the same kind of funding. And a lot of the products that we've grown accustomed to and are comfortable to us won't necessarily be feasible without this economic model. So we got Google search, which is just a backbone to a lot of the internet. We got our social media. We even have different news sites that you go to and consume. They're often supported by digital advertising, and that's not necessarily going to happen going into the future. So if a market crashed, then a lot of these things would be affected. And not only that, a lot of professions would be affected. For example, journalists that are connected to online news sites, people in video production like myself that are, make videos that are distributed on digital media, media creators, people whose livelihood depends on certain platforms that are free like YouTube. Things like that are going to potentially need changing. We might have to pay subscription fees for services that previously were free based on this model. And a lot of these things are all supported by this online advertising market that would potentially change. There's also local economies like that in Silicon Valley, where it's very based on these huge tech companies. All right, so what's the solution? What does Tim say we can do to make sure this doesn't happen? So one of the things Tim talks about to address not having good market-wide data is creating some kind of bureau. He talks about something called a National Bureau of Economic Research, which is a non-biased bureau that basically releases market-wide data on the economy. So we could have something like that for online advertising. He suggests something like a National Bureau of Advertising Research. Another solution that Tim proposes is a way to have more regulation on online advertising, which there isn't hardly any regulation of now. Actually, we're kind of depending on the tech conglomerates and the ad sellers to regulate themselves, like Facebook and Google, and their incentives aren't kind of based in the right direction. So the regulation would have ad inventory sellers, be legally required to provide a public or standardized statement on relevant info. Something that makes sure that the data is clear and honest and truthful to buyers, so that ad fraud doesn't happen, and if ad sellers are misrepresenting the effects of the ads or things or the data related to it, consumers will have the information and then they won't buy ads from them, and people will lose trust in that seller. So in conclusion, there's just a ton of factors and incentives that lead up to this disparity between the perceived value of the commodities in online advertising and the actual value that could cause a market crash, like what happened to mortgages in 2008. And that's the main argument in this book. To me, one of the most valuable things about this book was just the good plethora of information, especially market-wide on online advertising. And that's something I feel like we don't see a lot of, and I just found super interesting to think about and understand. And I would definitely recommend reading this book if you are, somehow connected to marketing or online advertising, or even if you're just curious about how the ad that comes in front of you, how it gets there, and the financial incentives behind it. Even more than that, it's a huge part of our daily lives, our attention being targeted by these ads, and I just think it's really fascinating. So this video ended up being a lot longer than I thought it would be, but I hope it wasn't too boring. I guess if you're still here, maybe there was something valuable to you or there's something interesting. So yeah, drop a like or a comment if you found this fascinating, and tell me what you were thinking about the subject. Do you agree with Tim Hwang and his points in the book? What are your thoughts to add to it? So yeah, thanks for watching and have a wonderful day.